I find it interesting that in today's political climate, it almost seems that you have to be close to a religious extremist to be taken seriously. I mean, if you listen to even John Kerry in the '04 election, he was trying to profess his, Catholic beliefs as a kind of litmus test for his legitimacy. Does that trend in American politics concern you?
Very much so. It's extremely dangerous. I think it's extremely cynical. I mean, the U.S. has been a deeply fundamentalist society since its origins. I mean, the early colonists were religious extremists, and the various waves of colonization.
The Puritans in New England.
Yeah, that spread across the country also were, waving the holy book while they exterminated the heathens and that sort of thing. And there've been repeated periods of religious revivalism. It's kind of like mass hysteria of religious revivalism. The most recent and quite significant one was in the 1950s. It's not that far back, and there are others. Since around 1980, I guess, something new has happened. The religious fundamentalism has been, political managers, party managers, and so on, recognized something that they'd kind of ignored before, that you can manipulate religious beliefs, extremist religious beliefs, into creation of a voting bloc. And since about 1980, what you describe has been the case. Just about every candidate for high office, a president, portrays themselves, whether accurately or not, as a person of deep religious faith. I suspect some of them are about as religious as you and I are.
Right.
Say Clinton.
Yeah, and for instance, Karl Rove has repeatedly said that he's not. In fact, he was mentioned in a recent article that he's not one of them. In other words, that they're cynically manipulating this base for their own personal power. So it's not that they're sincerely motivated by religious concerns, but they see this base as a way of ensuring their own self-interest. Is that a fair assessment?
I didn't see that comment, but that's the way. That's what I conclude from just observing what's been happening. I suspect, I've never really seen a study of this, but I suspect that it began with Carter, who was undoubtedly quite sincere. But he's the first president who sort of went out of his way to portray himself as a deeply believing Christian. And I think party managers got the point. You can use that way of appealing to a substantial electoral base. And since starting with the 1980 election, I think it's been just about every candidate. In 1980, I recall, there were three candidates, Carter, Reagan, Anderson, all presented themselves as, or their managers, their handlers presented them as deeply religious. Whether they were or not, who knows? Carter probably, I'm sure, was. I don't know about the others. And since then, that's been the case. And it's extremely cynical. And it's, for example, nobody cared very much whether, say, Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon went to church. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it wasn't an issue.
It wasn't relevant.
It didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Since, in these last roughly 25 years, it's right in the front. And, of course, it's not called religion anymore. It's called faith. Everything has to be faith-based, meaning some form of commitment, dedication to one of the organized religions, leading ultimately to the kind of comment from Romney that I mentioned, which was lauded, whereas it should have been bitterly denounced. And yes, that's had a very negative impact in a lot of respects, as is intended. I mean, it's a way to, from the point of view of party managers, it's a way to marginalize, control, and atomize a population that they're afraid of. I mean, they can read the same opinion polls you and I can, and they know perfectly well that the positions of the two political parties, or sometimes they're called two factions of the same party, on many crucial issues way to the right of the population. So therefore elections have to keep away from issues, as they do.
I want to follow up on the point you made about faith, because it almost seems that there's a connection between, the Republican Party and maybe in some ways the Democratic Party and a faith-based worldview. Because if faith is believing something for which there is no evidence, and the Republicans paint themselves as these sort of divine managers, for lack of a better phrase, it would seem that what the Republican electorate wants is a kind of submissive faith-based populace to secede their own political power and representation to them to sort of act on their interests, but yet at the same time, as you said, they're being cynically manipulated. Do you agree with that?
if you look at the opinions of the Republican base, they are not being represented by the Republican Party. That's true on issue after issue. Can't go through the details now, but there's a lot of detailed study of that. I've done some, and there's others. The population, including the Republican base, is strongly opposed to policy on many crucial issues, domestic and international. To give one example out of 1,000,
Sure.
In the last electoral campaign, 2004, it turns out that Bush voters were barely aware of his policies. Some small percentage of them, maybe 2 digits, were familiar with his policies. In one case, and there are many, a majority of people who voted for Bush thought that he supported the Kyoto Protocol.
When he did not.
Of course, he was strongly, I don't know what he thinks, but his party was strongly against it. But people believed it, and they believed it because they're in favor of it, very, very strongly in favor of it, and he's a kind of a nice guy. That's the way he's presented in the imagery and delusion that passes for elections here. So he must believe it. And it's the same on a whole bunch of issues.